It's official.
Hey guys, it's official here. I know I've been slacking on content lately, and I'm hoping to fix that by introducing a new series where I basically speak unscripted about certain topics that I feel like talking about. Kind of an open-ended discussion sort of deal. So I encourage comments and I encourage feedback. There's not going to be a lot of editing in this video format here because I'm just trying to talk about stuff like we're in a room having a discussion. There's a lot of freeform type videos like that out there, and I'm trying to, throw my hat in the ring. I've done something like this before with my rant video about Mortal Kombat 1's invasion mode, and it's a really easy kind of video to make. Not that I want to do more of them just because they're easy and that I only want to make easy to make videos. I do want to make other scripted content, it's just my interest in doing so. It comes and goes, like anything. And I just want to put something out there so that I'm not a month behind on making videos. I made a tweet about possibly making this Dragon Ball month, but the day after, I decided I didn't want to. I didn't decide that I didn't want to, it's just the spark of interest wasn't there anymore, so there's a good chance I'm probably going to hold off on that until I really want to make videos like that, because I do like Dragon Ball and there's stuff about it I would like to discuss. And as I've said before, I don't want this to be a Mortal Kombat exclusive channel. Mortal Kombat lately has done nothing but disappoint me, and it gets really frustrating when you just talk about something that lets you down over and over all the time. It puts you in a negative mood, it makes everyone around you feel negative, and I don't want to be that all the time. I don't want to wind up on a Reddit post one day on the dark side of the Mortal Kombat YouTube scene. I've seen a Reddit post like that before with some of my favorite YouTubers on there, and I sure as heck don't want to join that echelon. Although I'm probably there already, honestly. But no. What I want to talk about today is something that I really do enjoy. It is going to be another rant-style video, because it is something that genuinely upsets me. I'm going to be talking about the X-Men, my favorite superhero team. Specifically, a particular ship that Marvel is incapable of putting to bed. That being the relationship of Scott Summers and Jean Grey. Arguably one of the most iconic ships in Marvel Comics. The problem I have with them is that they've never been Reed and Susan. Reed and Susan are utterly inseparable. Sometimes they put characters in there that try to test the waters, like Namor. Although who would ever fall for Namor? Dude just runs around in his underwear all the time. But, with the release of X-Men 97, there's been something of a resurgence for the character of Scott Summers, aka Cyclops, the leader of the X-Men. People are starting to realize he's a pretty cool character. And with this resurgence in his popularity, people are starting to realize that he's something of a Riz-lord. The dude excels at bagging women that are way out of his league. Such examples being Psylocke from one of the earliest runs of Chris Claremont's X-Men. It wasn't too long after Magneto turned evil again, when he had been leading the X-Men for quite a while. So there was Psylocke, of course Jean Grey, his first relationship, I believe. They had been together since the founding days of the X-Men. And Emma Frost, which, in my opinion, is his best relationship. Period. There's a lot to be said about that era of Cyclops. There's a lot of people that think he was a villain, a lot of people that think he took things too far, that it became too much like Magneto, and became too heartless. This is especially because he's contrasted with Wolverine, who at the time had really come into his own as a character, and had even started his own miniseries, Wolverine and the X-Men, where he took a bunch of the mutant children from the mutant island Utopia and brought them back to the old mansion and reopened the school as the Jean Grey Institute in honor of the then dead Jean Grey. So because of that, Cyclops was very typically seen to be kind of ruthless and heartless by comparison to Wolverine, who used to be this rogue, this renegade, who did whatever the hell he wanted and didn't play well with others, to now being the headmaster of his own school. Whereas Cyclops, by contrast, saw the children as X-Men already and wanted to use them in battles because this was just after the House of M incident where the Scarlet Witch erased the majority of mutant kind and he wanted them to band together. Which I'm starting to realize more and more, there really wasn't a bad guy in that scenario. They both had very different approaches to the same goal, and it caused a schism between them. Get it? Schism? X-Men schism. That's when Scott and Logan went their separate ways. Anyway, I'm not talking about the plot of X-Men Schism, but I may do that someday because that's one of my favorite X-Men stories. I'm just here to talk about the relationship between Scott Summers and Jean Grey and how I feel it needs to be put to bed. I'm not happy with the direction that the X-Men have gone recently. I wasn't a big fan of Krakoa, or maybe it's not that I wasn't a fan of Krakoa. I wasn't a fan of the reception most of the community had towards Krakoa, talking like it was the best era of the X-Men in an unironic way, because every single mutant on Earth had relegated to the sovereign nation of Krakoa, which included many of the X-Men's most notorious villains, such as Apocalypse and Mr. Sinister, which was especially fucked up. Like, it was pretty messed up to allow Nathaniel Essex, I don't remember, Mr. Sinister to be on the island, much less lead it as a member of the Quiet Council. But the thing is, I'm pretty sure the writers knew that the Krakoa era wasn't meant to be seen as this amazing thing. At least I don't think Jonathan Hickman did. If there's a statement somewhere that says that it was unironically meant to be seen as this renaissance for the X-Men, where they're finally where they needed to be, then I don't know about it, and I fundamentally disagree with that stance. But what I think Jonathan Hickman's intention was with the Krakoa era was that it was supposed to be this ticking time bomb, because all the X-Men had abandoned their morals, essentially, to unite with these people that they used to hate, like Sebastian Shaw from the Hellfire Club, and of course Mr. Sinister, and Selene Gallio, and just all these different people that they had been beefing with for years, millennia, and they sort of embraced a philosophy that was more in line with what Magneto wanted, as opposed to Charles Xavier. Which, Charles Xavier in the comics, for those who don't know, is a very different beast from Charles Xavier in the Fox films and even X-Men 97. He's been doing shady crap for a long time, but his dream was still peaceful coexistence with mutants and humans. That was still his dream in the comics, despite everything that he did, or despite everything that he does, and the members of the X-Men that he may or may not have creeped on. How this relates back to Scott Summers and Jean Grey, though, because, again, this isn't a critique of the Krakoa era or any particular story, but I bring it up because it really brought to light what I don't like about the current X-Men, and especially the relationship between Scott Summers and Jean Grey. Scott Summers and Jean Grey moved on from each other a long time ago. Now, you could technically maybe say that Jean Grey never had the chance to move on because she spent a lot of her time dead. And it was Scott Summers who had to have the character development to kind of move on from his dead wife and enter into a relationship with Emma Frost, which was seen in the new X-Men run, which, despite its artwork, is widely touted as one of the best X-Men stories, or one of the best runs of the X-Men. And there was a lot of relationship drama in it. There always is in X-Men. It's literally a soap opera with superheroes. And there's a particularly infamous storyline, or maybe famous, depending on how you look at it, where Cyclops cheats on Jean with Emma in his mind. They create a psychic landscape because Scott Summers is dealing with emotional problems, and Emma Frost sort of acts as a therapist, but she kind of uses it to her advantage to take advantage of his emotional vulnerabilities and enters into a mental relationship with him. Jean Grey eventually finds out about this, and it does not go well. And I haven't read up on it in a while, but it was either before or after that event there's a scene with Logan and Jean where she kisses him and he has to turn her away. He's still very much in love with her, as he always is, but he has to be the one to say no. He essentially has to be the mature one in that scenario. But my point is that Jean and Scott very clearly have been having marital problems, trying to seek comfort in others where they can't find it in each other. And Jean Grey eventually dies in New X-Men, as she always does. She dies, and Scott is left to mourn, and he eventually turns back to Emma, and by the end of the run, they are in a relationship. And I believe that leads into Astonishing X-Men, where their relationship is more firmly established. And it's very much a romantic one. It started off not on the best foot, but throughout the story, you see as these two broken people, Emma Frost and Scott Summers, actually help each other and build each other up and essentially bring them into the best version of themselves. Because Emma Frost is a former villain, and Scott Summers has been dealing with a lot of crap as the leader of the X-Men for the longest time, having to sort of lead the fight in the mutant struggle. It takes its toll on you, and it broke him for a while, and Emma Frost helped him through that, and he helped her see a better side of herself, to the point that even Wolverine is able to acknowledge that Emma Frost is the sort of person that Scott would risk his life for, because they see that value in each other. They bring the best out of each other. And despite the rocky foundation that their relationship started in, it ended up bringing out the best of them. And if you ask me, I think it would have been great if that had become the new status quo, Emma Frost and Cyclops. But then the Uncanny X-Men came out after the House of M incident, and the mutants, or the mutant race, is sort of on their last legs, with only like 200 some odd left in the world at all, thanks to Scarlet Witch. And Jean Grey is once again back to life. She gets her own run in X-Men Red, which is one of my favorite runs of X-Men ever, and I think it showcases Jean Grey at her best without the Phoenix. I don't like Jean Grey being fundamentally tied to the Phoenix. I like her to be her own individual person, because I feel like when you tie her to the Phoenix, it's hard to tell what's Jean Grey and what's the Phoenix, because the comics will always try to convince you that they're one and the same, but Jean Grey very clearly acts very differently whenever she's with the Phoenix, almost to Emma Frost levels of conceited, and I don't like it. And I guess I'm the weird one, because I don't like that women talk like they're strong, even though that's not how I feel about it at all. I just don't like that the Phoenix strips away a lot of Jean's autonomy. At least that's how it feels to me. But anyway, back to Scott and Jean. So, in Uncanny X-Men, there is a point where the two X-Men teams, that's Cyclops' team that's kind of living underground at the moment, and Jean Grey's team, who's a bit more public, they reunite, and you get this infamous panel shot of Scott and Jean kissing, like as soon as they see each other. And I don't know who the artist who drew this thought that they were doing with this, but you literally get Wolverine and Emma Frost in the same exact panel, looking extremely hurt by this. And, you can't help but feel bad for him. And this panel sort of encompasses why I hate the Scott Summers and Jean Grey pairing nowadays. It was fine in the golden era. I'm not going to harp on X-Men 97 for having Scott Summers and Jean Grey back together, because that was literally during the golden age of the X-Men, when they were, the most prominent couple. So, that's fine with me. That's part of that dynamic at that time. It's immortalized. But nowadays, they have better partners that they could turn to. Scott Summers especially has Emma Frost, and it's just weird seeing him make out with his ex-wife, of whom he had literally cheated on, with Emma Frost, and is now just embracing her and making out with her like none of that happened, like he didn't have years worth of development while she was dead, with this person who helped bring him back from the brink of his lowest point in life. And then, of course, you have Wolverine, who is very famously attracted to and in love with Jean Grey. And it's not like it's a toxic kind of love either. Like, it might have started like that because at the time they weren't really planning to make the Jean Grey and Wolverine romance anything other than one-sided in Wolverine, on Wolverine's side. Jean Grey even tells him off in this hilarious panel where she just screams right in his face because he shows concern for her. But once it became official that there was a sort of mutual attraction there was always this sort of tease of whether or not Jean might leave Scott to be with Logan. And it was a bad thing in the sense that she was married to Cyclops at the time, and that's just not okay. Like, if you have that interest, you should definitely sit your partner down and talk about it. But after the mutual attraction was established, the dynamic changed because Wolverine stopped being just this guy who was attracted, who just happened to be attracted to the married woman on the team, and who hated her husband because they had beef. They had so much beef back in the day. Like, Scott and Logan's rivalry is infamous, and it still kind of exists. It still kind of exists today, and it came to a boiling point during the Schism incident, but it was never treated really as a toxic thing. They acted on it in toxic ways on occasion, like the example that I mentioned before where Jean Grey kissed Wolverine in New X-Men. But it's not like his feelings were treated as a bad thing. You know, she's a very important person in his life, and those emotions are very raw, and they're shown over and over to be very real. She's like literally his guiding light, his personal angel, to the point that when he like goes off the rails, she is sort of his guide back home. Like, he very clearly holds her on a pedestal, and I guess in a way that can be a problem, because sometimes it's hard to tell if he sees her as more of an ideal than a person. But I don't think that's how it's meant to. I don't think that's how it's meant to be seen. I definitely think he sees her as her own person, and that's who he fell in love with. And there's this idea that he only fell in love with her because she resembled an old flame of his who was also like a redhead and was kind of identical looking to her, which that's fine, I guess. There are romantic stories that have this idea where where this guy or this girl falls in love with this other person because they resemble an old flame that they had such a strong attachment to. And it's not always a bad thing, you know. Everybody forms a first impression somehow, and I think it's long past the point where that's the only reason. Like, he clearly cares about her as a person by this point. I guess this is just me giving my my PowerPoint presentation on why I think Logan and Jean need to finally be made canon. Because, like, every other Elseworld story puts them together. Even Chris Claremont did a story, X-Men Forever, that took place in an alternate timeline where the Logan and Jean attraction was much more prominent, and it got to the point where she actively confessed that he was the man she loved, and she ended up having a falling out with Cyclops over it. And then I believe they were together at some point in the Ultimate Universe. So there's a lot of Elseworld stories where they end up together. So it's clearly a popular dynamic, even amongst the writers. But they've never deigned to make it canon in the main continuity. And that really bothers me. Okay, so this is It's Official from the future here. There was another point I wanted to mention where Chris Claremont actually gave his thoughts on Logan and Jean, and he basically confirmed that they are endgame to him. He said the quote was something like, "Jean can love Scott with all her heart, and Logan can love Mariko with all his heart, but in 50, 80 years, 100 years, they're going to be dead, and Logan and Jean will remain. So the love they have for Scott and Mariko are temporary. The love they share for each other is eternal. It's mortal love versus immortal love, basically, is what he said. So even Chris Claremont supported the Jean and Logan ship. So back to whatever past me was talking about. Because I really feel like they deserve a chance. Like, I want to see that relationship explored. Even if it doesn't last, it'd be nice to have an era or a run of comics where they're together and we finally get to see like what that looks like. Especially because Jean and Cyclops they just don't need each other anymore. They have better companions. They've moved on from each other, and Marvel is insistent on maintaining the status quo by any means necessary. Any means necessary. And it bothers the living hell out of me. With the Krakoa era, they have very obviously brought them back together, and there were people speculating for the longest time that there was some weird polyamorous relationship going on between Jean and Logan and Cyclops and potentially Emma, because there were panels and certain lines of dialogue and straight up entire scenes that show characters in that circle outside of just Cyclops and Jean being very clearly and evidently romantic towards each other. Like, most famously, there's a shot of Logan and Jean in a hot spring naked together. So like, it's clear there's something going on there. But of course, most fans, for some reason, treat Cyclops as being the one at the center of it, in spite of all of X-Men history making it very obvious that Jean Grey is the center point of that love triangle. But that's a different conversation. The point is, the Krakoa era was very confusing about the relationships between the characters. But there was more than enough evidence that Cyclops and Jean were together and married in some capacity, with maybe, I don't know, some exceptions here or there for Logan, because he literally lived in the Summers quarters on the other end of Jean Grey's room. So there was something going on there, but the prominent focal relationship was very clearly Scott Summers and Jean Grey. And there's no telling where that would have gone if Jonathan Hickman had been allowed to remain in charge. Honestly, I feel like he should have, just so he could have seen his vision through, and maybe so the Krakoa era wouldn't have been as bloated as it ended up being. Because it literally brainwashed so many people into believing it was the peak of the X-Men. And, if we ever see them back in the mansion, I'm going to be so upset. Get over yourself. Anyway, this isn't something that's just exclusive to Scott and Jean. Marvel has a really bad habit or I guess all comics have a really bad habit of just maintaining the status quo by any means necessary. See Spider-Man One More Day, that infamous story where they retconned his marriage to Mary Jane. So it's like, because Scott and Jean started out as a couple, they therefore forever have to be a couple, despite them not being Reed Richards and Susan at all. That relationship is a lot more battle-tested than Scott and Jean will ever be. And another problem I have with it is just how awful of people they have to be to keep that relationship going. And there's no better example of this than Madeline Pryor. For those who don't know, Madeline Pryor is a clone of Jean Grey created by Mr. Sinister because he had wanted to harness Jean Grey's power, but he had considered Madeline imperfect because she didn't, at the time, appear to acquire Jean Grey's powers. She didn't seem to have the mutant X gene. So he discarded her, stripped her of her memories, and it was treated at the time as if she was just some look-alike of Jean Grey, possibly her reincarnation after she died. And Scott Summers immediately got together with her, and I think it was like in 7 issues of Uncanny X-Men, they ended up getting married. But then as soon as Jean Grey came back, I mean, they were already having some marital issues, but they literally had a kid together, and it was no less screwed up that as soon as he realized Jean Grey was back, he immediately abandoned his family to go be with Jean. And if I'm not mistaken, the retcon of Madeline being a Jean Grey clone was done to sort of make Scott's decision more understandable. which is really screwed up because the writers, and by extension Scott Summers, essentially had to dehumanize Madeline Pryor in order to justify him getting back together with Jean Grey, which is just one example of them being absolutely toxic towards other people just to maintain their clearly unhealthy codependent relationship with each other. Like at this point, that's genuinely what I think it is. It is an unhealthy codependency, and they need to just abandon it entirely because it's just really annoying at this point. And nobody's gonna say it because classic ship, ha ha ha, in your face, Logan. I don't know, but I do think the love triangle needs to end. I just don't think it should end with Logan getting over Jean. I think Jean and Scott should get over each other and be with the people that are literally better suited for them. Like, you could say, you can argue that they don't have any chemistry, that Logan and Jean don't have any chemistry, but Logan has layers upon layers of character. And Jean is a very compassionate individual. I don't know why they wouldn't click. And, they clearly already do click. There's a reason they're attracted to each other in the comics, there's clearly already something there. And I just think it's at the very least worth exploring. But of course it's never going to happen. They're going to keep Scott Summers and Jean Grey together forever, no matter how awful of a dynamic it is at this point, and how many characters they have to ruin in order to get there. I think Emma Frost is with Tony Stark now, why? Because they're both rich and snobby? Okay. And of course Logan is just going to be single forever, because every time he ends up in a relationship, one of them dies. I don't know, it's just something that frustrates me, and it's especially frustrating now thanks to the Krakoa era essentially resetting every single character dynamic back to its base roots. Just to make that story possible, they had to undo so many characters and retcon others and fundamentally change a majority of them just so they wouldn't all try to immediately kill each other. And that's really all I've got to say about it at the moment. My mind is a little muddied right now, and maybe I'll come back to this topic in the future in a more more scripted fashion. But right now, I just wanted to get my general thoughts out there, and I'd love to hear what you guys think. Please send messages in the comments and let me know what you guys think. If you have any opinions on Scott and Jean, or Logan and Jean, or Scott and Emma, because I really like to know. I'd love to get a discussion going. Yeah, have a good day.
Outstanding.